Good morning, and welcome to the second video in our WVD walkthrough series. Now, let me start by saying thank you. We've received great feedback regarding the content and clarity of the first session, and it's great to see so many of you now adopting the technology or looking at its potential. Because of that, I want to shift focus today and discuss the sizing and pricing of the solution. You see, I sometimes forget that the things that I get to spin up are free. Take this MV6 virtual machine running Microsoft Flight Simulator, for example. Now, this old Surface Pro 3 could never run the game, especially in ultra settings. But by spinning up a GPU-enabled VM, I'm able to stream the experience from the cloud. And that's the power of WVD. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that we use it to play games, but the point I'm trying to make is that scalable compute services can be tailored to meet your organizational needs. Joining us again today is our resident WVD specialist, George Wood, and he's going to help us walk through our cost and configuration options. George, welcome.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to see so many people engaging with this content. Now, when we think about building out a WVD solution, pricing should be top of mind. Here at Microsoft, we suggest that you break it down into 5 key points. These include defining your business objectives, and these range from understanding your existing infrastructure to defining your user base and type. Next, you'll want to think about your component pieces. We'll look at this in a bit more detail, but as with every infrastructure solution, you'll need to think about compute, networking, and storage. So from here, you can begin to estimate your monthly costs, and we'll spend some time this session looking at the tools available to do so. It's also worth thinking about potential discounts, including things like reserved instances and hybrid use. Ultimately, you should run through these steps so that you've got a better understanding of a price per user per month.
So George, tell me more about the tools that we can use to better understand our infrastructure. In our first video, we were building a greenfield solution, but for many of our customers, they'll already have resources on premises that they will wish to consume.
Exactly. And Microsoft has a rich partner ecosystem that offers a broad range of solutions to assist in mapping on-premises infrastructure. If you look at the link on screen, you'll be able to find a partner that suits your needs.
And let's just remind our viewers that we've recently recorded a video with our friends at Citrix and how we can combine our services. But rest assured, we will be investigating other partners in future sessions. So thinking about pricing the components, you've mentioned compute, networking, and storage, but I'm sure it's much more involved than that, especially if we're building a hybrid solution that will connect back to on-prem resources.
Absolutely. The thing that we should remember is that the solution is a shared responsibility. As part of your Microsoft 365 subscription, Microsoft will manage the upper layer of the service, including things like load balancing, session brokering, and diagnostics. This means that it's your responsibility to consider the lower level areas. If we focus on compute, for example, you'll need to establish both the number and types of users who'll consume the service. Will they be doing remedial data entry, or will they require a more powerful GPU-enabled environment? Azure has the capability to host sessions across a broad range of compute tiers, and because of that, price per month can vary. We will also need to include any other compute resources here. So if you're hosting your domain controller on Azure as part of a new deployment, you'd also want to include these costs.
Okay, so now we have a better understanding of the components required. What options do we have for cost estimation?
Ultimately, we've got 3 options: the Azure pricing calculator and then the WVD solution configurator, which comes in 2 tiers, simple and comprehensive.
And I'm guessing that the Azure pricing calculator will be the most familiar tool, as it would have been widely used to price infrastructure in the past. Let's take a look.
So we'll create a new estimate named pay-as-you-go estimate and configure our first virtual machine, which in this case will be a domain controller. We'll place it in the UK South region and configure the expected monthly consumption to be around 744 hours. If we come down to manage disks, we'll create a single small instance disk, as the virtual machine will be used for authentication only. We'll also want to change the currency of the estimate to British pounds. Once done, we'll add a second virtual machine, which will act as our always-on session host. Again, I'll host this in the UK South region and change my operating system type to Linux.
And it's worth pointing out that this is not because we intend to run Linux machines, but our licensing is already covered by M365.
Absolutely. We simply want to estimate our compute costs. So I'll change the instance to a D4 v3 and the compute hours to 744. From here, we'll add a premium managed disk and specify a P10 disk size.
Now, one of the cool things about the pricing calculator is the clone feature. We want to once again build out a session host, so this will enable us to quickly add the resources without needing much reconfiguration. This instance will be for peak times only, so we'll rename the asset and adjust the compute times accordingly. Next, we will add our storage account to host our profiles. Now, George, as I understand it, we have options here. This includes services such as a standard file share or NetApp. Could you possibly explain this in a little more detail?
Sure. So, as with all things, it really depends on the scenario. Now, in a larger Windows desktop deployment, you will want the most performance with the lowest latency, and this is really where Azure NetApp files comes in. However, there are still caveats. It's more expensive and there is a 4 terabyte minimum size requirement. Because we're only building a very small Windows virtual desktop solution that will support no more than 10 users, a simple file share is therefore adequate. So again, I'll host the resources in UK South region and configure the type and performance. We don't require snapshots and our metadata will typically be about 10%.
I guess one last caveat to be aware of is the storage required if you're going to be performing diagnostics. Now, I can't imagine this will consume much space, but in the sake of transparency, you're going to want to add additional storage to your estimate if you intend to use the feature. So, the last thing that we want to do is calculate our expected bandwidth.
Yes, and as with most things on Azure, this will be chargeable. So you need to ensure that you calculate your expected bandwidth requirements correctly. For example, low resolution sessions with basic data input will require less bandwidth than sessions running in 4K and hosting services such as CAD.
Okay, so with that done, let's save and export our session. Now, when the Excel spreadsheet opens, we will want to add a row for our M365 licensing. This works out at about £15 per user per month, which will give our example a new total of around £500. Now, George, while £50 a user isn't extortionate, what can we do to try and reduce the overall cost of our solution?
Well, we really have 3 options. We can configure reserved instances, we can configure resource scaling, and we can make use of our hybrid use benefit. So let's take a look at these in a bit more detail. With reserved instances, you can choose between a 1 or 3 year commitment. Think of it as signing up to a mobile phone contract. You typically yield bigger savings the longer you agree to use the service, and with Azure reserved instances, this could be up to a 70% discount over pay-as-you-go pricing. Of course, this is only if you intend to run the machines 24/7. If you're adopting a more fluid approach, then scaling your resources based on demand will be the more sensible option. Finally, as a benefit of software assurance, you can make use of Azure hybrid benefits. This will enable you to maximize the value of your existing on-premises license investments and slash the costs of your virtual machine deployment by reducing the licensing charge.
Realistically, you'll probably combine all of the methods in a production environment. So let's jump back into the pricing calculator and make some adjustments where we can. I'll begin by renaming the estimate and then expanding our domain controller asset. Now, obviously, our DC will be running 24/7, so this is where we can see the biggest impact of our cost optimizations. Notice how it currently stands at around £115 per month. But when I select a 3-year reserved instance, the price reduces to £77. Then, by selecting our Azure Hybrid benefit, we can reduce the cost even more by utilizing an existing license. As you can see, we've significantly reduced our monthly expenditure, in this instance by 76%, just for our authentication server. But George, where else could we possibly reduce our costs?
Well, we also have one of our session hosts running 24/7, so again this would be an ideal candidate for reserved instance pricing. As you can see, when I select the 3-year option, my estimate is reduced from £128 down to £54. But remember, we also have another session host being used only in peak hours. For that reason, it wouldn't make sense to create a reserved instance, and scaling is therefore the better option. So with that, let's save and export so we can compare our costs from before. Now, if you cast your minds back, our original estimate came in at just over £500, and we've now reduced this to £334 by utilising our cost optimisations.
Thanks, George. Now, while I appreciate we're doing this for a small deployment, what guidelines can we offer customers wishing to build this out on a larger scale?
Well, there is an option on the pricing calculator for larger deployments. If I select Windows Virtual Desktop, the tool will help configure the session host components based on usage and workload types. Do bear in mind though that unless you are connecting back to pre-existing resources, you'll need to configure the other assets to make sure the solution works. For example, in this instance, we will need to add a domain controller for authentication, a storage account for our profiles, and expected bandwidth utilization. Once configured, you can see an estimated cost of about £1,300 per month. Now bear in mind that is for 100 users, so when we combine that with the £15 per user per month charge for Microsoft 365, you'll average a monthly cost of around £28 per user.
Thanks, George. Now, the pricing calculator is a great tool that will enable you to price a quick estimate. But for companies who wish to be more granular, we also have the WVD solution configurators. George, could you walk us through it?
Sure. So we have two options. There is the quick solution, which can provide a quick insight into the costs for a deployment, and a comprehensive section that will provide a much more in-depth understanding of expected costs. So let's quickly run through a demonstration of the tool. One of the first things you'll notice is there's lots of tabs. Do not let this scare you. For a quick solution, this can be done from just one. The first thing we'll do is change the currency to pounds. Now, because we're running a scalable solution, we will not include a file server, and therefore Azure hybrid use benefits are not required. I'll select a Windows 10 multi-session environment and set my user type to heavy. Like before, I'll configure a 100 user solution and select a pooled resource type hosted in UK South. For consistency, we'll once again choose a D4S virtual machine and configure a pay-as-you-go pricing structure based on 240 compute hours. Now, when it comes to storage, the tool will encourage us to use Azure NetApp files. While this isn't mandatory, and in our previous demo we opted for an Azure file share, in larger scenarios, customers may benefit from the increased performance and lower latency of the service. We'll also keep all the defaults for networking, but bear in mind this will need careful consideration based on user type and expected workload.
Thanks, George. So hopefully we've shed a little light on how you can price up your WVD solutions and help avoid any miscalculations in the future. It's our hope that you found this session useful and look forward to seeing you on the next. Thank you.